But the footprints was the first strange event they noticed. So they painted over the footprints, and the next day the footprints came back, which freaked out their friend Nicola. But what was even weirder is that they came back in a different part of the kitchen. It wasn't the same footprint, it was a different footprint. So that's when it all started to go a bit weird.
Keep watching to learn more. You can now download all 9 copies of the New Thinking Aloud magazine for free, or order beautiful printed copies. Go to newthinkingaloud.org. New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Book 4 in the New Thinking Aloud dialogue series is Charles T. Tart, 70 Years of Exploring Consciousness and Parapsychology, now available on Amazon.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring the Dodleston Messages, which happens to be one of the most anomalous, intriguing, puzzling cases in the annals of psychical research. A case that dates back to the 1980s, but there's currently quite a bit of revived interest in the case. My guest is Dr. Paul Rogers, who is currently a freelance researcher and visiting research fellow at the University of Northampton in England, having previously been a senior lecturer in psychology at other British universities. Dr. Rogers has published over 50 peer-reviewed papers within the fields of social psychology and social cognition, including 20 papers on various aspects of anomalistic psychology, such as paranormal believers' proneness to probabilistic reasoning biases. He is currently researching the Dodleston Messages. Dr. Rogers is in the United Kingdom, and now I'll switch over to the interview video. Welcome, Paul. It is a pleasure to be with you and to discuss what I have to think has got to be one of the most intriguing cases in the entire history of paranormal research.
Indeed, it is. Yeah, it's a rabbit hole of things to go down as well. When you get into it, the more you get into it, the deeper it gets. It's quite astonishing, really.
Well, to my understanding, the central person in this case, a man named Ken Webster, was a school teacher. He wrote a book about it called The Vertical Plane. First came out in 1989, which would be appropriate for events that took place in the 1980s, but recently republished.
Yep. So what happened was around about COVID time, Debbie, who is the main central person in the story,
Ken Webster's girlfriend,
Ken Webster's partner. Yep. So it's really those two, the primary experience. But Debbie noticed that the original copy, the 89 copy, was on eBay for £1,800. And she thought people are getting ripped off. So she's going to do a second edition. Ken added another sort of chapter at the end. What have we learned in the last 35 years? Added another little chapter from the third experience, who's called Peter Trinder, who's no longer with us. So the second edition's got a couple of bit of extras. And you can get it now on Amazon for about £17, which is a bit cheaper than £1,800. So that's what she did it for, yeah.
Because we're talking about a time gap of some 30 years, nearly, and or more, and the main witnesses seem to maintain the same story they started out with.
I first met Debbie in '06, which is now nearly 20 years ago, at an SPR conference in Liverpool. And we got chatting, and we've debated this. I've lost count how many times we debated it. But over 20 years, she's been pretty consistent. And around about COVID time, I was sort of like 95% of the way being convinced, but you always have to maintain a bit, come back. And then after COVID, when the second edition came out, somebody near Manchester set up a Facebook group. And since then, the last 5 years, we've had up to 200 people at one point, but really it's about hardcore 35 people who are researching. And the more we dig, the more we find that's convincing, that suggests it's true. So I'm sort of like 99% of the way thinking this bizarre as it goes, we can't find any evidence to say it's not true.
Well, you could view this as a case of time travel or communication across time, or you could view it as a poltergeist case. Let's give our viewers who may be unfamiliar with the case completely a sort of an overview of what we're talking about.
Ken and Deb were living in a place called Dodleston, which is just about southwest of Chester, about 5 miles of Chester, near Liverpool. If you're not from England, it's not far from Liverpool. It's on the border of the England-Wales sort of crossover part, because that may be a relevant factor. And they were doing their house up. Very, very, very small house. I mean, literally it was a 2 up, 1 down. It was tiny. And they had a friend stay over. She was staying for a couple of weeks, and the friend noticed some footprints on the wall. 6-toed, barefooted footprints. And they had a laugh about it, and they painted over them. And the next, there were some other things beforehand, like little bits of tin cans moving around, or coffee was falling around in the sink, which they just thought was each other. They didn't think anything of that. But the footprints was the first strange event they noticed. So they painted over the footprints, and the next day the footprints came back, which freaked out their friend Nicola. But what was even weirder is that they came back in a different part of the kitchen. It wasn't the same footprint, it was a different footprint. So that's when it all started to go a bit weird. So that was the first bit of poltergeist activity. There was other stuff, like I said, there was things like cat food moved around, or things balancing. But the first really weird thing was that Nicola sort of went off on her own merry way. And around about December 84, Ken, who had borrowed a BBC microcomputer from school. This is 1984. There was very, very basic computers. They were essentially word processors with no internet, no email, no remote access whatsoever. He borrowed one of these computers from school, and he got a message, or rather, there was a message that he thought Nicola had left on the computer. So he opened it up, because she was doing a bit of screenwriting, and he thought, well, I'll have a little nose, see what she's writing about. And it turned out the message was a very weird, nonsensical poem. Didn't really mean much, but it was addressed to Ken, Deb, and Nick, the 3 people living in the cottage at the time. So they didn't really do much about this. They sort of had a joke about it. They accused each other of hoaxing. They thought it may have been a third party, but there was no evidence of a break-in. And as I said, there was absolutely no way anybody could use remote access in those days. This is 1984. So about 2 months later, I'm going to say, I think it was the first week of March, maybe late February 85, they get another message. But this time, it's not a poem. It reads like early modern English. And it talks about, it says, it doesn't give a name, but he says, you're in my house. I can see bright lights. I can see furnishings and items that only the king could afford. What are you doing in my house? Get out, basically. And it's like, so they're just assuming it's a joke. They're assuming somebody somehow has come onto their property, typed this into the computer. Bear in mind, this is not the same physical computer now. He's taken the computer back and he's got another copy of it. So he keeps going back with the school and borrowing different physical computers. So there's no possibility of anybody breaking into the hardware and implanting anything. So Ken responds to this sort of early modern English message saying, okay, who are you? What year are you talking about? Who's the king? And about, I think a day or maybe a week later, I think it's about a week later, he gets another message saying, I live on the property, blah, 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 blah. The king is Henry VIII. And the message is dated March the 23rd, 1521, which is over, 400 odd years in the past. So I'll sort of cut down a bit, but there's messages going backwards and forwards between, on the one hand, 1985, Ken and Debbie, and on the other hand, this character who initially signed himself LW, but he didn't say who he was. As the messages progress, he signs his full name Lucas, and then Lucas Wayneman, Waiman. And so Deb and Ken, by this point, have had about maybe, a dozen or so messages. They start looking in the local libraries for Lucas Wayman. They find nothing. I'm skipping bits now, but there's other communications going backwards and forth. At one point, Lucas says, I was working at one of the, I think it's Christchurch, I think it was, Christchurch College, Oxford, he says. And then the next message comes along and he says, why did you not pick up the fact that there is no Christchurch College? Turns out Christchurch College was built in 1571, 50 years after he was allegedly talking. And it turns out that this character called Lucas was actually trying to trick Ken because he didn't trust who Ken was. He thought Ken was a devil or a demon of some sort. Anyway, moving down a bit, it turns out that the character's name was not Lucas Wayman at all. It was Thomas Harden. He'd given a pseudonym to protect himself. So Deb and Ken started to research Thomas Harden, and they found Thomas Harden. One of the things he talked about Thomas Harden was the fact he was a fellow at Brasenose College in Oxford, which was built at that point. It was built in about 1509, I think it started. So they found evidence of Brasenose College having a character called Lucas Wayman.
Wayman or Hartman?
Thomas Harden is the real name of the pseudonym that was Lucas Wayman. Yeah, it gets confusing. Yeah. There is actually a Lucas Wayman, but I'll tell you about that in a second, who he is. We haven't found many details of him, but there is a character called Lucas Wayman. So Deb and Ken, mainly Deb. Ken at this point is still teaching. He's busy. Deb does some research, through the old physical journals in the 1980s. He had to literally go to the libraries and spend all day doing it. Found evidence of Thomas Harden. He claimed to have been at Brasenose College, and we found evidence that there was a Thomas Harden at Brasenose College. One of the messages, he says, now by this point, Ken's work colleague, Peter Trinder, who is an expert in Chaucer, which is early English, he started to read the messages and he started to do backward translations because it wasn't written in modern day English. And Peter spent hours and hours and hours backward translating what he realised was early modern English into modern English. And one of the messages he received said, do you know the following people? And this character, who at the time was still calling himself Lucas, but we now know to be Thomas, said, do you know these people? And named 9 different people. And if you look in the Brasenose College directory, they're all in there. They were all founding fellows of Brasenose College around about 1511, 1512, going up to maybe 1530. So another thing that I'll call him Thomas. When I say Luke, we'll call him Thomas. Another thing Thomas mentioned was some of the stuff he was researching as a fellow there. And he mentioned 5 books. And we found all of them. All the 5 books are genuine. There was one slight inconsistency with the authorship of the first book, but that's because people don't really know who the authors were. But the character that Thomas mentioned is named in the book. It's a very obscure book. It's like 500 years old, 400 years old. So the literature he referred to seems to be genuine. The characters he referred to seems to be genuine. And as you progress forwards, more and more information comes out. So, for example, I'll give you one example. The local sheriff, now bearing in mind Thomas is living in Dodleston, but in the year 1521, it turns out it was really 1546. I'll explain why that is in a minute. But around about the 1540s, there was a sheriff called Thomas Falshurst. Thomas mentioned him. Thomas Falshurst allegedly put him in prison for witchcraft. And we have found evidence of a Thomas Falshurst being sheriff of Nantwich in around the 1530s, just as Deb and Ken were told. So really, the only way you can say this is a hoax, it can't have been done by a third party electronically because there was no remote access. It wouldn't have been done by anybody breaking into the property because it was so small, there's no way anybody could have got in there without being noticed. So it has to go down to either Ken writing it alone, Ken and Debbie writing it together, or Ken, Debbie and Peter writing it together. But Peter has been on TV. There's a TV show in the mid-90s called Out of This World in Britain. He's been on there and he has openly said he believes this to be genuine. There is another character who I've not mentioned yet, a character who was introduced later on in the day. He was a ufologist in the 80s, still going, called Gary Rowe. I'll give you more details about his input in a minute, but he has been on TV, or rather video, for the Swansea UFO network, and he has said this is genuine. And it really boils down to, do you think Ken has made this up as a story, which is about 400 pages long, I think it's 350 pages long, who has kept the same story going for the last 40 years, whose partner Debbie has her entire life changed. So for example, she told me that in the 80s she bought a computer to try and understand how this was working, and it cost her £16,000, which is the size of a small house at today's prices. She's gone on to study hypnosis. She's gone on to become a computer expert. She's worked in mental health with schizophrenic people to find out if that had an impact, if that was it. She didn't know. One of her friends went on to become a parapsychologist before he wasn't, till this case happened. And everybody that gets involved with this case who knows anything about it, and that includes the 35 people on the research group, the more you dig, the more it looks like it's genuine. And I know that sounds ridiculous. I know it does. But, if this is the hoax, which I don't think it is, it's the greatest ever hoax going. But as you said at the start of this interview, if it's genuine and all the evidence is pointing to it being genuine, it's also one of the most amazing paranormal phenomena ever as well. So, and there's a part of the story I've not even mentioned yet.
Well, let's step back for a moment, because the messages appeared on the screen of a computer that had absolutely no internet connection, no outside connection at all. So it would appear there, and then Ken or Debbie would type messages into the computer, and apparently they were able to be read by a person 400 years in the past who didn't have a computer. So how is this individual 400 years ago, or close to 500 years at this point, not close to, really 500 years ago, how are they to communicate since they don't have a computer, but they're communicating on a computer?
This is one of the common mistakes people make when they talk about this case. There's two really big ones. The first one is people refer to the ghost in the machine. The character Thomas, who was living 500 years ago, was not a ghost. Right? He was alive and kicking in his own time. Okay, you mentioned earlier it may well be a time slip type phenomena or transdimensional phenomena. So the first thing is he was definitely alive, and the second thing is he did not have a computer. What he claimed through the book is that he was sitting in his kitchen one day and he looked up and there was a character in his chimney. a green glowing light. Now, if you look on the front cover of Debbie's second edition, there is a picture of a green glowing light, which is what is called the Leams Boist. Okay. Now, according to Thomas, a character stepped out of his chimney and gave him this thing called the Leams Boist, which is translated as a box of lights. Now, for what we can make out, Thomas didn't have a keyboard like we do. He spoke to the Leams Boist, and he would see words appear in 3 dimensions in the air, like a hologram. Okay, and he found that out because one day he had a housemaid called Catherine, about 15 at the time, and she was singing. And as she was singing, he noticed the words appear in midair. So when she left the building, he had a go, and that's how he started to communicate with Ken. Now, Ken would get it through a computer like with a normal old-fashioned keyboard word processing document. But he didn't have that. He had a floating... Well, the Leams Boist may not have floated, but when he was talking into it, the words he would come out with would float, and he would see those. That's how he communicated. Now, whether it's a hologram, we don't know. How it worked, we don't know. This is all up in the air. I mean, you know, Thomas didn't have a clue about cars, let alone how to understand this sort of stuff. I mean, we don't either. But that's how he didn't have a computer. He had a Leams Boist, which is a box of lights. And he referred to box of lights.
And as you said, it was presented to him by a being of some sort who materialized in his chimney?
Yeah, I know what it sounds like. Trust me, Jeff, I know how mad it sounds. Thomas claimed that a character called One came out and just basically gave him this thing and then disappeared. Now that makes me wonder, why was this character called One? I do wonder if that's like the first ever time traveller. In the same way James Bond is 007, he will be 001, maybe, I don't know. But that's what Thomas claimed, that some character who may have been a hologram himself, we don't know, handed over this thing called the Leams Boist, which Thomas then communicated with 1985.
I'm perfectly willing to take everything you've told me at face value and look at the implications. The implication, for one, would be that we live in what some people call a block universe, where the past and the future exist all at one time. So the past is still there. The future would also still be there. And second of all, it implies that the potential for a being like this One to be outside of our block universe and able to interact with it in uncanny ways.
Well, the reason it's called the vertical plane, I'll introduce a second character now so the readers or the audience can have a clue what I'm talking about. Around about 6 to 9 months into this communication with the past came a statement from Thomas which said, "You mentioned you was in 1985. I thought you were from 2109, like your friends who brought me the box of lights." Right? So we think One may or may not have been from the year 2109, but there was a character, whatever they were, whether it's a human, an alien, or whatever they were. Maybe Debbie thinks they might have been artificial intelligence. We don't know. But something or entity calling themselves 2109 got involved. And the way they were talking, I've always thought they sound like physicists from the future who have somehow managed to work out time travel. At least not physical time travel, but informational time travel. Because they are communicating through this computer. So 2109 seem to be running the show. They refer to things like the experiment, and that we're not in control of the experiment, but we can see basically you have a purpose in this world and you'll be doing X, Y, and Z. They didn't give details, but they suggested there will be important, decisions to be made, sort of thing. They did make a prediction in about 1985 about Fermat's last theorem being solved. Now, for people who don't know, Fermat's last theorem is a very, very complicated mathematical conundrum, which started in the 1637, I think. But it's about 350 years old. And 8 years after the prediction was made, it was solved eventually by somebody called Andrew Wiles, who got the Nobel Prize for mathematics for that. And the way it was described, it's going to be resolved with a brand new mathematical, not even a formula, a way of thinking about mathematics which is completely different. It's exactly what he did. No, I'm not a mathematician, I won't go, but I did read that the proof was 100 pages long. So was that a coincidence that this arbitrary character called 2109 made a prediction? We don't know. But it's looking like it was a genuine acknowledgement of what's going to happen in the future. So 2109 are getting involved, and Ken doesn't like these people because he's got a friendship and a relationship with Thomas Harden from the past, and 2109 keep getting involved and trying to take control of it. So at one point, I think Thomas suggested, and this is going to get even weirder, Thomas suggested Ken leave a pen and paper on his kitchen table, which he did, and somehow Ken received messages on bits of paper, so the computer wasn't even involved anymore. There was still a trans-dimensional connection, or a trans-temporal connection, between the 1500s and 1985. And I know this sounds crazy. Believe me, I know.
Well, the whole story defies conventional logic in almost every regard. As far as I know, it seems as if there isn't a single hypothesis that perfectly matches the phenomenon, even dealing with the linguistics. But let me ask you this now. The book originally published in 1989 contained, I gather, all these messages. That
not all of them. I think I've counted 178. There are about 300, over 300, but they were told by the publisher in the 80s that you have to cut it down, it's too long. So they kept about 55, 60% of the messages in there. I have seen other messages. So when I first met Debbie, she came along and with some folders, A4 folders, with loads and loads of messages in this hard, almost impossible to read handwriting from early modern English period. How Peter Trinder managed to backward, translate that, I have no idea. I couldn't read it. But I have seen about 7 or 8 folders of this handwritten material.
But what about the messages that appeared on the computer screen? Were they printed? Was there a printer involved?
In those days, printers were expensive. Not many people had them. So Ken, who'd borrowed this computer, would take the computer or the floppy disk or whatever, take it to school, print it off, give the hard copy print to Peter, who would then spend 3 hours a night backward translating it. So there are hard copy prints. I think I know where they are. But they're all pretty much printed in the book anyway, but the actual physical hard copy prints are stored away somewhere. Yeah.
And now you've been studying this case for a number of years, I gather.
Well, I've known Debbie 20 years. We talk an awful lot, not always about the case, but a lot about the case. And about 18 months ago, I spent full time looking at some of this stuff. Yeah, so I'm sort of working on this, but not just me. The Vertical Plane Research Group, and I can give you the details of that later. There's at least, I would suggest, 30 people who are actively researching this, and some of them are historians. They're all different backgrounds. I'm a psychologist, or anomalistic psychologist, you might say. We have a parapsychologist on the team, but most of the people doing it are from the history or archaeological background. So to give you an example, I was chatting to Debbie about a week ago, and there is somebody who's got a PhD called, I think the PhD was called Castles of Dodleston, and her digging has verified the groundwork of a map that Thomas drew 500 years ago and sent to Ken. So although the modern day maps don't look like what Thomas drew, but when you dig under the ground or use LiDAR, they overlap. So even modern day, things we look at modern day doesn't map up. When you dig deeper and you do the actual research, it is consistent with what messages Ken got.
What you're saying is that you would endorse the hypothesis that this was an authentic case of communication across a time gap of some 500 years. Not just backwards.
It looks like 2109 were genuine. Now, we don't know if 2109 is the year, the assumption it would be. Now, if that is true, then that would be 125 years ahead of 1984. So what's it now? It's about 85 years hence. Okay, it could be a code. We don't know what the name 2109 is, but the assumption is it's them. I mentioned a minute ago, 10 minutes ago, I mentioned a character called Gary Rowe, who he lived in North Wales, still does, I think. He, at one point, 2109 said to Ken, there is a ufologist called Gary Rowe. Here's his telephone number. Give him a ring. Okay, so they did. And Gary Rowe is on video saying this. I mean, we have a YouTube channel that I can give you details with as well, and I think that's on there. But Gary Rowe is there, and he's sitting there basically saying, I got this strange telephone call from some bloke in Dodleston saying this nonsense story. I don't believe he's taking the mickey out of me, but I'll go along with it, he says. So he goes along with it. He basically says to Deb and Ken, I want to have complete access to your house, which he does, which surprised him. He ran some experiments, and what happened at the end, he started to get messages himself from 2109, not via computer, via letter, physical paper letter, in an envelope, left on top of the computer terminal in Ken's kitchen. Ken wasn't allowed to look at these, so Gary Rowe is getting messages left to him via 2109 that Gary Rowe will never disclose because it's top secret. And he's on camera saying exactly that. So if it is a hoax, then Ken's hoaxed, Debbie's hoaxed, Peter Trindra's hoaxed, a completely stranger called Gary Rowe has hoaxed. 35 people at the research group are finding stuff out that supports this case, and they've all been hoaxed. And the more we go into it, the more it looks like it's genuine.
Let's go back to some of the poltergeist type phenomenon as well. You mentioned the footprint with 6 toes climbing up the side of the wall. Is there any further revelations as to what that might have been?
Thomas did not use the phrase poltergeist because that wasn't invented back in the 1600s, but he referred to similar sort of phenomena going on. And he was getting quite annoyed because it was waking him up at night time. So various poltergeist-like phenomena was occurring to him. And at one point, Ken did say to 2109, can you stop this? And they went, no, we can't. We don't know. I mean, there was a message that Ken and Deb got written on their floor in chalk that they don't think was anything to do with the transdimensionality. They think that might have been a poltergeist activity. They got a lot of poltergeist activity. If you buy the book, there are maybe half a dozen photographs of things like, I mean, one of them is a balancing saucepan on a door frame. There's a picture of their kitchen and their front room being trashed through poltergeist activity. So again, a skeptic will say, oh, they've done that for the camera. But they haven't. They hadn't. The whole room was trashed. They had writing on the floor, which was poltergeist-like. And it's almost like this is a completely separate entity. This is almost unrelated to the time dimension. We don't know. 2109 were aware of it, but they couldn't control it.
And at some point, the phenomena, I gather, just stopped.
Yeah, I think the poltergeist activity sort of wanes, but the final messages were dated 23rd of March 86. Thomas said, I'm missing large chunks of the story, but Thomas had to leave the house. Now, Thomas was originally living in Dodleston on the same site. And you mentioned earlier ago about block universe. The reason the book is called The Vertical Plane, it's almost like time is like a multi-story car park. Same physical space, but different levels of it. So Thomas says, look, I have to leave Dodleston. I've been threatened by the locals. They all think I'm a witch. And somebody's offered to buy my house, so I'm leaving. I'm going back to Oxford, which is where he originally was a student. And he said, I'm going to write my book. And he made reference to staying in Dodleston, hopefully one day meeting Ken and Deb and crossing time. The very next day, or the very same day, a message came through from 2109, same date, 23rd of March. And they said Thomas did write his book. He died shortly afterwards, so we're talking around about 1548, 1550, something like that. He left it in a secure place. It shouldn't take too long to find it in your lifetime. Well, that was 40 years ago. We haven't found it yet. They also gave an inscription of what was written on either the inside of the book or on the cover of the book in Latin. And it reads something along the lines of, I write this book in the hope that one day my friends will find this book and our lands won't be so distant. So we're hoping one day we find a book carbon dated 500 years ago with that sentiment on the front or in the inside cover, and then wait for the skeptics to turn around and say, oh, you backward engineered that. Because if we do find it and it's carbon dated, you can't get much harder proof than that. As bizarre as it sounds, that's what we're waiting for. We haven't found it yet, but that's what we're looking for.
Well, are there any other examples that you would just think of as more evidential?
You know, I've known Debbie 20 years. I think it's all genuine. But then there are photographs of the whole house being trashed, you know. And again, Debbie, I've got Ken and Deb to write down, put in writing, there's no deception on their part. So they've either blatantly lied to me and have done for 20 years, or this is genuine.
I understand that Ken himself, though, has distanced himself, doesn't want to be involved.
Not at the moment, because he's still got a career. Yeah, he was a teacher at the time. He sort of left teaching, got into something else. Debbie has worked on this part-time. So I met her at a conference. I've known her go to conferences at her own great expense on, for example, quantum mechanics to try and understand this. You know, she's not a physicist. She's a self-taught computer expert. But she will go out and spend money to try and work out what happened. But Ken's had his...
As you say, they both attest that this is not a fraud on their part. Of course, fraudsters would say that. So it's still hard to imagine how they could have created such a fraud with all the accurate information that only came out much, much later.
And also, I haven't mentioned this, but we mentioned earlier the computing side of things. One of the members of our research group, I won't name him, but he's retired, he actually invented Wi-Fi. All right? He got into the case because he thought, what a load of old nonsense, I'm going to prove it to be fake. He got into the case and he's now convinced it's genuine. Now, he invented Wi-Fi in the mid-90s, maybe 92, 93, something like that. This is like 6 or 7 years after this happened. And I've got him on one of my PowerPoint slides, a quote saying, basically, there's absolutely no way this could have been hoaxed, because the infrastructure, the hardware, the software, the expert knowledge was not available to anybody in the 80s, let alone Ken and Deb or whoever. So even if I don't know, the Pentagon wanted to have a go, they wouldn't have been able to do it because there was no physical, hardware or structure to do it. So the only way you can say this was a hoax, the only way, is if Ken has made the whole lot up. And if he's made the whole lot up and it's all by sheer coincidence coming true, then that seems even more unlikely than the actual story, to be honest.
Well, I guess people have to balance. David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, probably would say it's much more likely to be a hoax than a miracle.
I didn't say it's possible, I just said it happened. And that was Ken's little quote that he stole.
That's from Sir William Crookes.
That's right, yeah, it was, yeah, Crookes, yeah. But it was about D.D. Hume, wasn't it, I think he was talking about?
Yeah, I didn't say it was possible, I just said it happened. And that's sort of, because what you're describing goes against what people might call the standard model today. Our version of reality doesn't allow for this sort of thing at all. But our version of reality is really a cultural artifact of sorts based on who we are at this particular point in time. And in another 80, 90 years, for all we know, humanity will have developed a whole new version of reality.
The way I think about it is if you told Queen Victoria, I can take a book and send it to Australia and it'll get there in 3 seconds flat, she'll think you're talking nonsense. But she would never have had a conception of a PDF, which we now do. Okay, so we can send books through the internet, basically not physical matter, but information can go down the line, go through time, go through space, and get to Australia in a matter of seconds. We have to think outside the box. That's the way I'm looking at it. You know, this is going to be at least 80 years in the future, if it is a date. And we have no idea what's going to happen in the next 80 years. I mean, look what's happened in the last 40 with technology. You know, it's exponential. So that's the way I look at it. It's just the future we don't understand yet.
Well, is there anything else you can add about this case that our viewers should know?
Well, we are constantly researching. I mean, I say we're all amateurs in terms of the amount of time we have to do this, but the research group, I'll give you the details if you want people to join. I'm sure Clive will be happy to have loads more people signing up. We are constantly doing research. I say we're getting more and more information. I say just last week there was evidence that the map that Thomas sent. I can give some more little anecdotes in a second that Dennis told me. But the map is getting more and more. It's a very, very complicated map. It's a hand-drawn map written circa 1546. I don't think it's in the books, but I've got a copy of it on my lectures when I give it. It's really detailed, and the research group have been going through that with a fine-tooth comb, and they've been mapping out and finding evidence that the places on there were genuine. But the interesting thing about the map is the roads that were drawn no longer exist, but they are coming up on LiDAR, or as I said earlier, a PhD in archaeology has confirmed some aspect of the map that she spent 3 years researching. You know, so again, is that a coincidence, or did Ken have some sort of ESP? I don't know. I don't think so. It just seems to have, you know.
I presume there's nothing in the messages that would indicate why, of all of the possible places in the world where such trans-time communication could occur, it happened at Dodleston.
Well, the property has had poltergeist activity both before and after Debbie moved out. I mean, she's not been there for, I'm going to say 15 years at least. You know, she moved, but they've kept in touch. So there was some activity, nowhere near as spectacular as what Debbie and Ken got. But there's something about the location. And Debbie has commented at the time she was researching, there was an earthquake around about the period. And apparently, where Dodleston is on the line between England and Wales, it's a bit of a fault line as well, I think. They may be factors. Another thing that Debbie's looked into was geomagnetic activity. And apparently there was a high amount of that around about the time. They may be factors. They've been linked to poltergeist activity. That's different from the time travel side of things. What was I going to say? The one that really got me, I love this. So some of your viewers may have heard of the skull experiment.
Absolutely. We've interviewed Robin Foy on this channel.
Oh, right. Okay. I might have seen that actually. Yeah, a few years ago now. So one of our research group members said, read the skull report. So if you read the skull report, I don't think the official skull report mentions this. That's the one by the SPR, Society for Psychical Research. But Robin Foy wrote a book. It's about 600 pages long. It's very, very detailed, very diary-like. Right at the end, there is a comment along the line, well, there's about 2 or 3 comments across about 6 pages, referring to transdimensionality and the time travellers from 2109. So, what the possibilities? 1, Robin Foy read Ken's book, made up his entire skull experiment, and then decided to just mention 2109 at the end of it, just for giggles. Right? By doing that, he then managed to convince 3 professors and numerous other witnesses that the skull thing was a hoax, because, you know, okay. So he read Ken's book and just nicked the phrase 2109, or it's genuine, and that 2109 got involved somehow with the skull thing as well. Now, the second edition only has this information. There's an extra couple of chapters in the second edition. There was somebody in, I think it was Luxembourg, and somebody else in Germany who also were communicated. One by 2109, one by 2105, and one of those, I think it was their name, Fishbane, I think their name was, can't pronounce it, but they contacted Ken in about 85, 86. Sorry, no, 95, 96, about 10 years after their case. And they were saying we've had similar phenomena.
This would be the people working with what they call instrumental transcommunication, voices coming across computers and televisions that are even unplugged.
Yeah. I mean, Debbie suggested that her case, I said yours must be one of the first cases of ITC, and she went, there was one more before hers, she thinks, but hers was pretty much, if not the first, then certainly the first 2 or 3 computer-mediated ITC examples, yeah.
Because Konstantin Raudev wrote a book about this, as I recall, that came out in the 1970s.
Yeah, he was mainly radio, wasn't he? Breakthrough, was it called?
Yes,
yeah.
Breakthrough.
Yeah.
So what you're suggesting, there could be a link between some of these very obscure and anomalous phenomena.
Well, on the surface of it, there should be no connection between Skull. So for people in America who don't know where Skull is on the east side of England. It's in the county of Norfolk, probably, I don't know, 20 or 30 miles away from Norwich, I'm guessing, I don't know. But where Dodleston is, it's the other side of the country. It's about 200 to 300 miles away. The Skull experiment took place between 93 and 98. Debbie's case was between 84 and 86, so there's no real time connection. And yet both of them refer to 2109. You know, so is it a coincidence or is this a genuine phenomenon? I mean, as I say, you know, I've spoken to Debbie. I've lost count how many times about this. We speak a lot about this. And, you know, I'm always getting bits more of information, a bit more tidbits. And if she was hoaxing, it's a big if, but if she was hoaxing, she's the world's greatest actress. And I don't think she is. I don't think she is hoaxing.
Well, since you've known her for 20 years, you would be in a good position to judge.
Yeah. I mean, we've had so many. I mean, I think of it this way: if I was a journalist, and I managed to get an afternoon to interview Debbie, which she doesn't do. She won't do interviews. I mean, she did 1 or 2 in the late 80s, and I think there's a newspaper interview she gave, and there's a little bit on Radio 4, BBC Radio 4. There's about half an hour of her, or 15 minutes of her left. If you listen to that, for example, on the YouTube channel we set up, there is an audio clip of Deb and Ken in 1989, I think it is, and they're talking about it in the same way they might talk about their cousin or their long lost brother. You know, it's genuine the way they talk. There's a TV show called Out of This World, which is 96. They were interviewed on there. When you listen to the way they talk, they're talking as if it happened, because to them it happened. It actually happened. And yet it sounds like absolute nonsense. I know it does. You know, you either believe it or you don't. And I've sort of experienced some of this sort of backlash from people I've debated it with. You know, they come up with their ideas why it's a hoax, but they haven't got any evidence for it being a hoax, and all the evidence points to it being genuine, as bizarre as it sounds.
Well, Paul Rogers, this has been a fascinating excursion into one of the most mysterious cases. I think it's very significant that you're aligning yourself with a group of some 30 people who are digging into it more deeply and coming up with new findings that verify the original claims.
We're looking for the book.
Mm-hmm.
We were told it's in a safe place. Now, that's ambiguous. And, of course, we can't say too much in case people decide they turn up and knock on people's doors. But we have ideas where it might be. But if it was ever found, that would be... I know debunkers will still say it's all a hoax. It's been carbon dated. It's a hoax. It's got the same transcript on there. It's a hoax. I know certain people will never believe it.
They will never believe it. People will tell you, I won't believe it even if it's true.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I've seen it, but I don't believe it. Yeah. There you go.
Thank you so much for being with me today.
I can't believe an hour's gone so quickly. I mean, I've only scratched the surface. This is. People want to buy the book. I am plugging it, yes, but just for you know, it's just the more you get into it, the bigger the rabbit holes go. Really do.
Well, you know, we have done another interview earlier with Simon Dwan, who I'm pretty sure you know, a British computer scientist who has his own theory about Platonic computation. He feels that this case can be explained in terms of his theory.
I'm not entirely sure what Platonic computation is, because I'm a psychology, not a physicist or mathematician, so that's beyond me. But maybe I'll get around there one day, yeah.
We've covered it pretty extensively on this channel because there are many different theorists who have what we call simulation hypotheses, that our entire physical universe is actually a projection from you could say a computer that is located outside of time and space as we know it.
Right, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I was chatting to Ken, 2 days ago about the informational model, and he's got an idea, which is, and it reminded me of the noosphere, which is what David Vernon wrote about in his book on parapsychology, and it maps into stuff like the Akashic record argument, and when you think about it, there's an overlap between all these different models. They're just given different names, and so I think it's informational based. I certainly think that the time, if it is time travel, it'll be information. It won't be physical matter. It'll be time. It'll be like we do with PDFs, sort of thing. That's the way I'm looking at it. But yeah, again, it's beyond us at the moment. But maybe.
Well, once again, thank you for being with me, Paul.
No problem. No problem. Happy to come back again. And if you find anything else out,
I would be delighted to stay in touch with you because this is an ongoing case. New information seems to be coming out month by month, year by year. So I'm optimistic we'll have more to say about it in the future.
If we find the book, I'll let you know.
Okay.
Yeah.
For those of you watching or listening, thank you for being with us, because you are the reason that we are here. New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at CIHS.edu. You can now download all 9 copies of the New Thinking Aloud magazine for free or order beautiful printed copies. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.
Book 4 in the New Thinking Aloud dialogue series is Charles T. Tart, 70 Years of Exploring Consciousness and Parapsychology, now available on Amazon.
For early access to our videos and live stream events, sign up for our free weekly newsletter at newthinkingaloud.org.